Hello and welcome back to 40 Minute Mentor, the podcast on a mission to raise aspirations and inspire the next generation of category defining founders, all in just 40 minutes. I really hope you're enjoying our VC feature series so far and the bonus episodes brought to you by Corinne Thompson and Ecap Financial. While last week we took it right back to the beginning and discussed the crucial steps and preparation you need to take before you begin your fundraising journey, today we're looking at what comes next, setting up your company for a successful exit. In this episode, Corinne will break down what it actually means to set up for an exit as a founder. She also shares when you should realistically start to think about it and the crucial do's and don'ts when it comes to preparing for a smooth transition. No matter whether you're actively planning for a potential exit as a founder or you simply want to future-proof your business, Corinne shares some super actionable advice for navigating one of the biggest decisions in a founder journey. So let's dive straight in. Wanted to come on to talk about sort of setting your company up for an exit, which is the holy grail for all founders. So what does setting up for an exit actually mean in practical terms? And when should founders start to think about that?
Yeah, an exit can mean like a myriad of different things to different people. Some companies will IPO or want to IPO. Some companies want to go through some kind of trade exit. Some are sold to private equity. If you're a founder, you might do a large kind of secondary and move into a kind of like chair role. And I think there's different kind of variations of what that exit piece actually means. And it also depends on the type of capital you've taken on to date. I would say, like, before I kind of give the specifics there, I used to do corporate development, and a lot of corporate development is understanding who you should partner with as you go through the journey of the company, not only from like an exit perspective, but also to block your competition from partnering with these like entities and potentially getting the exit that you might wanted. So I would say, think about the route that you might want to take in terms of that exit. One thing that I personally always used to do was investment bankers are there to help sell companies. They also have there to help fundraise, but they're also helping companies sell. And one thing that I've personally found is like, if you go to them and say, okay, we're thinking about this in the future, then they are very willing to do kind of like market analysis and market maps and like give you a lot more data than you can probably sit there and do kind of like, gleaming through kind of like PitchBook or Crunchbase or whoever it might be. And you can get kind of metrics and stats and information just pertaining to like, okay, these companies were doing these sort of metrics at the point that they sold, or this was the revenue, or like these were the value levers that made this company like super attractive in the market. And they can give you a lot of information that then sort of gives you more of a kind of guiding light of where you want to take your company to before you go through some kind of like exit event. And a lot of these ones that I see around, like they give you the valuations, they give you multiples, but they're like, okay, these guys were doing this in ARR. This was their ARR per FTE. These were their EBITDA numbers. Like they give a lot of kind of detail behind that. So I say that's probably a starting point when you start thinking about what kind of exit you basically want.
Great, thank you. And what are some of the most common exits you're seeing with founders you work with? And how has that changed over the last few years?
The IPO market overall has been quite subdued, but I speak more about that from like a US standpoint. You typically see more, I'd say, US companies kind of pushing for that sort of like big IPO. There's a lot more companies, I'd say, that I see going through some kind of trade exit. Like typically the sort of starting point for any sort of transaction like that, any kind of like buy-side M&A piece, is like 5 million of ARR. And sometimes companies like bootstrap their way to 5 million. And then they're like, okay, you know what? We've done a really great job. And now actually we want to exit the business and sell it on it and move on. And then there's some in the VC space more who are kind of like, okay, either the market has subdued and therefore they can't see a route right now to either continue that growth or to push for profitability. And therefore they need to sell sort of quicker than they would want to. And then there are some founders who you have to be careful when you're taking on funding because the valuations keep going up and up, and you need to get to a certain valuation point so that your latest investors who have come in are actually getting some kind of return on their money. And it does mean it forces certain companies down the route of like, okay, you need to find a big buyer with deep pockets, and that really like limits the number of buyers that you can access, or you have to push for an IPO if you're going to get that kind of like return. But what I would say that I typically see is normally founders have partnered with institutions along the way, and those partnerships have grown. And then it's got to a point where that partner might be like, okay, cool. Like, we're now interested in acquiring your business. And so that's typically the way I see the trajectory at the moment.
Great, thank you. And what are some of the most common do's and don'ts when it comes to preparing for an exit?
Yeah, I'd say on the do side of things, again, a little bit like fundraising, because like the sell side M&A is just, it's effectively the same as fundraising, which is make sure you've got all your ducks in a row in terms of all your financials are solid and sound. Like, you've got all your documents together, you've got all your collateral prepared, you know what the pitch is going to be. Like, everything's kind of like wrapped up and ready to go there. And then I would say on the commercial side, a little bit like the fundraising, like, make sure you're out and speaking to people in the market. And you don't have to say that you're necessarily going through some kind of like exit, but like, you just have to be kind of warming people up and talking about your business and being excited about your business and being, super charismatic to like what the potential of the company is, to then see if you can like bait someone almost to be like, okay, cool. We might be actually interested in like some kind of like synergies here, and there might be some kind of acquisition here. I'd say the other things maybe to think about are, in the same way with fundraising, you get some kind of term sheet with like sell side M&A. You also get a sort of set of terms, and sometimes those involve certain targets that you have to meet as a founder going forward. And it involves things like golden handcuffs, where you have to stay at a company for a certain length of time and meet those targets while you get paid out basically upon that exit event. And so some of the things to think about in your head is more like, okay, if we were to be acquired, how much cash do we get to keep in the business? How much autonomy do we have to make investments to carry on growing that top line to hit those targets? That means that then we can also like reap the rewards of what that exit might look like. But what I would say is, with fundraising, you can definitely do it with like a corporate advisor of any sort. But I would say with like an exit, you probably want to use a kind of reputable investment bank, corporate advisor, just to, who can bring the experience of like having gone through that process before.
Yeah, sounds well worth getting the right support around you for such a big event. As a founder, then, how do you know when you're truly ready for an exit or an acquisition?
Yeah, I think a lot of founders maybe leave it to the point where they're almost like exhausted and they're like, I'm done. Like, I can't continue to take this company further any longer. Yeah. And I think it's more a case of, and like hindsight is a wonderful thing, I'm sure, for a lot of individuals, but like, it's more a case of, as you're going through the journey, being like, okay, what might the next sort of like 3 to 5 years look like? And am I still the right person to be the CEO? And it may be a case of like, if you're not the right person or you don't think you have the skill set, it's more a case of, okay, maybe I need to start preparing for that transition now. And that transition may look like them moving out into a different role or a different function in the company and bringing a seasoned CEO or, whatever that role was that that individual was filling into that kind of gap. It may also be a case of like, actually, as the company builds and grows and they look around the market and they see what's happening in the market, there could be things happening in the market that actually dictate, then, you know what, maybe joining up with someone and having a much bigger entity and force means that we'll have more leverage over the market. Whereas like staying as we are could mean that we get consumed within the large market in a way that we might not want, or we would lose market share or whatever that might be. So I think it's a case of more of every year that goes through the company, like looking forward and being like, am I still the right person in this role? And if not, what might that look like? And then looking outwardly, being like, what is actually happening in this market right now? Is there a lot of consolidation happening, or is it still a growing market? Or like, are there new entrants that pose this kind of significant threat? And like joining those kind of two pieces together.
Thank you, Corinne. And what advice do you have for founders who are balancing scaling a rocket ship, fast growing business, but also preparing for an exit? That feels like a very tricky thing to balance out. What would you advise for anyone that might be going through that or hopefully going to get to that point?
I think sometimes people underestimate how much energy and effort goes into a fundraise, particularly if you're sat here in the UK and you're saying, hey, I want to raise in the US. Like American investors want you in their geography, in their space. And I'm talking about fundraising or some kind of acquisition exit piece here. Like you need to have that sole dedication to getting through some kind of like fundraising or exit event. And that's why I always say, like, get all your material prepared up front, get all the collateral prepared up front. Just make sure that anything that can be done in advance is completely done in advance. And therefore, like, you don't necessarily have to worry about just being out there and pitching basically on repeat. I'd say using external advisors also can help that process to a certain degree, and means that founders then have a little bit of bandwidth, or CEOs have bandwidth to carry on focusing on like the day to day. But going into a fundraise alongside just having all that collateral paired, I'd also say make sure that your kind of key C-suite that work for you, they're prepped and they know what's required to keep the company moving forward, making sure that metrics are still tried, making sure that problems are dealt with, making sure that errors are put out immediately. Like having that basically in place is critical. But yeah, like I would say for fundraising and exit, like never underestimate how much is required basically in terms of like energy to go through that.
That's important advice. Thank you. And how do you personally work with founders to prepare them for an exit or acquisition? And when would you say is the right time for founders to bring on external advisory support to get them ready for such a big occasion?
Yeah. Fundraising, we do buy-side M&A and we do sell-side M&A. And like I say, the fundraising and the sell-side M&A tends to be quite similar in terms of like what we do is we build financial models, investor decks, data rooms, TAM Samsung calculations, like any of the kind of collateral that gets the business ready and in a good place basically to go out and fundraise. On the buy side M&A, if a company is looking to acquire another company, like we'll often do the financial due diligence as part of that acquisition process. And we do kind of like synergy modeling as well, i.e., when the two companies come together, what might the cost base look like? What might the revenues look like? What do we need to be really mindful of and consider going forward? In addition to like normally myself or my team, like what I would say is often at the later stages of fundraising, and then definitely during some kind of like sell side M&A process, like bringing on board an investment bank or a capital advisory boutique is a good idea, just to help with the kind of just to help with making sure that you have the right entities that you are approaching to sell your business or to go through some kind of like fundraising round. And those guys, like particularly if you go to the big investment banks, they've been doing this for significant periods of time, and like they are very well versed in terms like the do's and don'ts of that process. So that's kind of the setup, I would say, as you think about that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I really hope that you found it useful and inspiring. If we have left any questions unanswered, or if you have any feedback or guest recommendations for future series, then please make sure you get in touch on info@jbmc.co.uk. I often get asked by listeners how you can help us spread the word about 40 Minute Mentor. There are two simple ways you can help. Firstly, share this episode on your preferred social media platform, and LinkedIn is probably where I'm most likely to see it. And you can also leave us a review on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Every share on social media and review left on the podcast platforms really helps us to get 40 Minute Mentor in front of new audiences and share the power of mentorship even further. Thank you so much for your ongoing support, and I look forward to seeing you again next Wednesday for even more pocket-sized mentorship.